Hey y'all, welcome back to another Anomaly Arbitration guide, this time featuring the return of 3 familiar faces. The previous apocalyptic shadow boss in Skaracabaz arrives at today's King stage, with King Pom-Pom having been demoted to Knight status. Nikador also makes a return from MOC, but not without a handy bit of buffing first. And of course, these new clown elites are really quite something. Feel free to skip to whatever timestamps you need in the description below, check out the presentation link in the description, and well, let's begin. Night 1 features the usual return of our 4 enemies on field, elite plus mob wave spam. It's like old Pure Fiction never left us, huh? It's really nice that you can place a stainless here, since out of the 3 enemies, the elite can actually provide a neat heal to your characters, while you can play Russian roulette with the SD Mechatron, or bring Elation to fix the odds in your favor. Of course, you'd much rather bring Elation to the other Pom-Pom shaped elephant in the room, but in general, teams that thrive off either lower pressure to sustain, like Anax and DOT, should do pretty well here. Characters that perform well versus enemy spam, like the Nova Flare Seal and Firefly, also really enjoy being able to continuously pick up resets. And while the built-in healing mechanics, plus the prevalent fire and lightning weaknesses, all but signpost this as the Mortanax Blade stage, whether you want to play him with Ashvale, Acheron, or as his own hyper carry. The hardest part of the stage is actually taking off, thanks to Depowered nerfing your start by taking away both your energy and energy regen, and the new Flow Break punishing attacks thrown out willy-nilly, making subsequent attacks stack on both damage reduction and a flat crit damage penalty, and resetting the stack counter only on follow-ups or AHA instants. Characters with fixed start of battle energy, like Firefly and Bladey, with honorable mentions to Aglaia and Saber, can completely ignore Depowered's penalty, while those with special energy systems like Acheron, Phynon, and Cyrene just don't interact them at all. Wonder who's coming up on rerun next banner. Honestly though, Flow Break isn't the biggest concern in the world, given how Mortanax Blade, Tribby, and Danhong PT are pretty generic follow-up supports capable of slotting in anywhere, though the 2 Chrysosairs being screwed over by Depowered's energy debuff still isn't ideal, obviously. And well, Firefly has Dahlia. At the end of the day, 20% damage reduction and 40 crit damage in the worst case scenario isn't still all that bad, especially since the debuff applies to the enemy side, and you're usually going to be resetting that debuff counter naturally by moving from enemy to enemy. Depowered is definitely the worst offender of the 2 here, and even with how this stage is set up, it's more of a slog than an actually threatening debuff this time. Starting with our newest elite, the God-Devouring Offspring has a pretty simple attack pattern, beginning its turn 1 with a single target defense lowering attack, then causing one ally to enter the Devour state, cutting their max restorable HP in half like Nikador, and stealing 1000 attack from them. Considering how level 95 enemies have like 700 attack, if it works the bad way where they end up having 1700 attack after this, then this could be around a 2.5 times damage increase if you sit around doing nothing. Of course, you do have the very easily accessible option to hit it 6 times to slowly refund your missing HP and attack, or just break or kill it to get it all back at once. The HP refund also comes with a sneaky upside, as unlike with Nikador, restoring missing HP also comes with healing that much actual HP. This means that whoever gets devoured can heal as much as 50% max HP for free, with the maximum heal requirement being just having 50% or lower health before Devour hits you. And as a bonus, whoever lands the final hit also gets a flat 500 attack boost for 3 turns, which translates to about a 40% attack buff for most characters. Obviously, this is most broken when letting Mortanax Blade tank the HP loss to sustain a self-trained playstyle, then having the other DPS he's supporting secure the attack buff for themselves. But generally this is just a very nice elite. Anyways, turn 2 is just the same single target attack, followed by an AoE. Pretty simple. As for mobs, the SD Mechatron makes its return, with the first one spawn charging up immediately and subsequent ones taking a turn to charge first, which can be dispelled by breaking them. Otherwise though, upon being hit, they will immediately leap up and have a 50-50 chance, supposedly, to either hit and stun one of your characters, or hit an adjacent enemy for a decent chunk of their health. Hitting the max with elation damage fixes this enemy hit chance to 100%, of course. If I'm to believe these numbers though, this means that this enemy was actually buffed in favor of non-elation teams, as the non-rate chance for the SD max to hit enemies used to be 25%. Quite a good sign if they're lowering the elation shield, especially with round 2 of the collab characters coming up. At least one can hope. And the third enemy is kind of the reason I didn't really mention the Herda as being particularly pleasant versus this AoE stage. Because, well, if her entire team losing all their starting energy wasn't enough of a nerf, along with the slower energy regen due to a hard cap of 4 enemies on field instead of the usual 5 with like Pure Fiction, how about debuting a mob with 80% ice res just for her? Yeah, sorry Herda mains, this really isn't your rotation. Here's the order in which these mobs spawn. After the initial 2 mechs, Clown and Assistant, we have a pretty consistent pattern of Assistant, Mech, Clown, Assistant, Mech, repeating 3 times, then followed by 1 final Assistant at the end. This mainly just means that the elites are spaced out every 4 mobs overall. While there are signs of elation enemies becoming far more reasonable though, it definitely doesn't tell the whole picture, as the return of our favorite boss proves. Wave 1 is basically identical to last rotation, just with 10% more health, and the addition of the RNG heavy autonomous wands. As such, quantum characters don't do particularly well here, with no weaknesses to exploit, and the return of the 80% quantum res mech. Wave 2 features the return of Mecha-Pom-Pom, with not just nearly identical HP to its king appearance, but also quite a substantial debuff in Stability Plus. Losing 20% of your final damage actually makes this enemy tankier than its king variant only 2 rotations ago, though specifically for dot and crit archetypes, as the damage decrease is a weakened debuff which only affects characters that use damage percent. Yeah, Break and Elation got a free pass, as if they somehow needed even more help versus an already favorable matchup. Just as a heads up, the following enemy damage values do take their 10% damage reduction from Stability Plus into account. The first enemy I'd like to revisit explaining is the Canvas Peacock. It starts with no weaknesses and has its toughness hard-coded to be unable to go below 1. In its initial state, it deals only weak single target attacks, and in order to be able to break it and unlock its weaknesses, you must make it enter its color state, which requires adding a total of 6 paint to it. Regular attacks will add 1 paint of their respective type, while elation damage hits add 3. The type of paint added is important for 3 reasons. First, any paint types added to the Canvas Peacock will become its weakness types when entering the color state, including with the additional minus 20% res that comes with traditional weaknesses. Second, the punchline it gives when entering the color state is 5 times the paint it has the most stacks of. So if you, for example, only hit it with fire type attacks, then it will have 6 fire type paint, and thus give you the maximum 30 punchline upon entering the color state. Third, the bonus damage it deals during the color state is typed based on the paint it absorbs, and if that damage is a different type from the character getting hit by it, it is multiplied by 50%, which is represented by the higher blue damage numbers from the attacks it performs in the color state. So pretty much, if you have a fire DPS, you do not want to get hit by imaginary damage, though honestly it is kind of hard to have some control over that. Anyways, once it enters the color state, it will then use up its paint with a single target attack, followed by an AoE on its first turn, then the same thing on its second turn, but with a stronger AoE. Breaking it will cause it to prematurely lose all of its paint and return to its colorless state, as well as making it take 3% of its max HP as damage per every remaining paint, making this enemy quite favorable for Break as well as for Elation. The next elite to note is the good old Daybreak Squadron Azurewing, with its trademark 80% quantum resistance. Its first turn is a single target hit followed by a blast hit, both of which hit fairly hard, and the second turn is another single target hit followed by entering its force field state. In this state, it cannot be CC'd, has its toughness locked, and will advance upon receiving any quantum type hit, dealing a massive single target nuke, which notably does include the non-elation AHA instance damage. Thanks AHA. Hitting it 7 times after this point will dispel the force field state, adding both 30% vulnerability and 40% quantum res down, though it is important to note that it still has 40% quantum res remaining after this. Breaking it early prevents it from being a threat as always, though otherwise it's just there as a heavy hitter and of course to discourage you from using any quantum units. The autonomous wands added to this wave 1 are pretty straightforward, having a 1 in 3 chance upon being hit to either buff their attack by 50%, advance all enemies by 50%, or inflict stronger reverberation on all other enemies, delaying and stunning them for 1 turn. This also generates 3 punchline no matter what, letting even non-elation teams instantly trigger AHA instance in order to make the Quantum Res Elite even more of a long-term threat than it usually is. Very fun design. Especially when you consider the nightmare that is Mecha-Pom-Pom. On turn 1, which is 50% advance, it performs a single target attack, then gains 60% damage reduction and boosts its damage by 30%. These self buffs are only removable by gaining 20 Punchline twice, which at the very least rewards you with an extra 10% max HP off of Pom-Pom. But when consider how most Zero Cycles tend to get around this by trying to kill Pom-Pom before this turn even happens, yeah, it's not great. At the very least, there is the option of using Welt's ultimate beforehand or even mid-turn to interrupt the damage reduction. The second turn is a single target, followed by an AoE that also refunds 3 Punchline for the team. Other ways to gain Punchline from this boss include killing the 2 enemy alloy Pommies that start spawning pretty soon after Pom-Pom's first turn, and continuously spawn a bit over every half cycle onwards. Each kill grants 5 Punchline, so removing just 1 stack of damage reduction off of kills alone will usually take around 100 action value, or a full cycle. Quite annoyingly, these Pommies alternate between regular single target attacks and single target attacks that reduce your defense by a massive 50%, making it so that said character takes 33% more damage. If you notice yourself dying unexpectedly to Pom-Pom's attacks, this might be part of the reason why. Though luckily, you do at least get an ally alloy Pommie to help you out too, who deals about 1% max HP off Pom-Pom every time it attacks, granting 5 Punchline and immediately gains an extra turn every 20 Punchline gained, being the one to remove the lasting anti-bax damage reduction stacks and depleting an extra 2.5% max HP every time it does so. Still though, with it acting every 70 action value and no king buff this time to boost its speed, it's not exactly what I would call fast either. While Phase 1 does have a small window where you can try and burst Pom-Pom down though, Phase 2 has no such thing, not only initiating the damage reduction immediately, but bumping up that total damage reduction value from 60% to 90%, forcing you to either try and save a Pommie extra turn to remove a bonus stack as fast as possible, or just play its stall game, costing time no matter which method you choose. Turn 1 of this phase is an AoE that applies a one-time buff to all your characters, making basics deal 2% max HP as additional true damage and refunding 5 extra Punchline, heavily encouraging their use, and letting skills refund 1 skill point, essentially making most of them free. This is then followed up by their traditional AoE with plus 3 Punchline attached. When factoring in the 30% damage buff, this ends up working around to about 2000 mandatory AoE damage, making this fight a pretty rough sustain check even for most Elation teams. Turn 2 is then another AoE followed by a charging action, and turn 3 is a big nuke followed by a single target attack. Overall, what makes the stage really annoying is the 4 stall mechanics of Mecha-Pom, as well as the fact that this boss is literally tankier than its King incarnation, while also lacking any of King and Check's helpful buffs, and also needing 2 extra teams to allot to the other non-trivial stages, meaning if you have no trouble versus this stage, you might be doing so at the cost of making your other knights harder. What a boss, am I right? Speaking of non-trivial knights though, Nikador returns for Stage 3, and well, it seems like he took the MOC fraud allegations pretty seriously. For some reason we have the 80% Fire Res Elite alongside the Furiae Praetor, which if Nikador wasn't a naturally bad matchup versus Break already, well, we have this anti-Firefly measure to really drive the message home. While this stage would normally be solved by DPS capable of spamming turns at the wazoo, the stage debuff this time, Hemovore, complicates this matter greatly. DPS like Anaxa and the Herda are now forced to run a sustain in order to just survive, especially when considering Nikador's whole set max HP to 50% gimmick. At the very least, this Hemovore debuff doesn't go through shields, making shielders like Danhung PT or Aventurine still plenty viable, and also lets characters like Silverwolf 999 and Mighty receive buffs mid-turn in their enhanced states by inserting the HP loss during their turn, but before their forced autoplay. As for Nikador's HP, or rather I should say Nikador's Pillar's HP, it's increased from a respectable 953k in MOC to a whopping 1.58 million, or a 65% increase in HP. Yeah, you're probably going to need 1 to 2 more nukes compared to your average rotation in order to actually take this boss out. Quantum and Ice characters are pretty good here overall, especially since the forced HP loss mechanic is quite beneficial to characters like Evernight and especially Casterus, and otherwise, energy-hungry characters will enjoy the plethora of max energy buffs and energy regeneration this stage provides. I'm gonna skip over the fire resistant Blazeweaver here since it has the exact same attack patterns as the quantum resistant Azurewing mentioned earlier, so scroll back a bit if you want to know its attack patterns. Before talking about the Furiae enemies in more detail, let's just do a quick review on how exactly their shared mechanic, War Armor, works. War Armor is present in the form of stacks, and grants 10% damage reduction if any of those stacks remain. One stack of War Armor is removed per hit against that enemy, with joint attacks counting as 2 attacks and thus removing 2 stacks instead. Upon depleting the War Armor entirely, the character that last hit the enemy will gain a portion of their max energy, the enemy will be delayed and take a significant chunk of their max HP, and any subsequent attacks before their War Armor is restored at the end of their next acting turn will deal an added chunk of their max HP as fixed damage. You can pause to see the exact numbers below, but with that out of the way, let's start with the Wave 1 Furiae Praetor. Its turn 1 is a sleep attack on your right 3 characters. Note that Memo Sprites also take up a character slot if they aren't named Cyrene's Demiurge, followed by summoning 2 Furiae warriors that perform single target attacks that have a chance to pre-stun if they still have Warmer on. Its second turn is a sweep attack on the left 3 characters, followed by charging for an attack next turn. This attack does a decent amount of shared damage across your entire team, doing even more if you still haven't somehow eliminated the extremely squishy Furiae Praetors. Like, guaranteed dying to any 10 hits is pretty squishy, and also inflicting 30% vulnerability on the team afterwards for 2 turns. If you really need to, you can mitigate the shared damage further with Memo Sprites, though of course they tend to be a pretty good matchup versus this stage naturally anyways. As for Nikador, technically being 2 entities at once, he has a lot of actions, so while a lot of you are already familiar with his mechanics, let's review them again since the last time I did so properly was way back in 3.0. Yeesh. Turn 1 is a single target attack, followed by an AoE, after which the giver spawns 1 Conquer Be Conquered pillar for each ally character on field. This also sets all allies' maximum restorable HP to 50% max HP, with that number being raised proportional to the amount of damage dealt to the pillar. Characters will also deal double the damage to the pillar assigned to them, so it never hurts to keep that in mind when factoring in the impact of your attacks, especially since killing the pillars depletes 13.5% of Nikador's max HP, or 54% total for killing all 4, unless your name is Phynon, of course. So especially for AoE, but honestly even for single target DPS, you have a pretty huge incentive to wipe these out if possible. Turn 2 is a bounce attack followed by a weak AoE, where Nikador changes his War Armor into Titanic Corpus, and grants all ally characters 1 Glory stack. Glory grants 30% damage and 10% energy regeneration rate per stack, and using a skill or ult sets that character's glory to 2 until the effect disappears. This is also important, since unlike War Armor, Titanic Corpus gets reduced per hit equal to the number of glory you have, letting any character remove 2 stacks at a time instead of the usual 1 after using their skill or ult at any point. The other major change from War Armor to Titanic Corpus is that the 15% max energy reward for breaking it is now given to all characters instead of just the last hit character. Otherwise though, Titanic Corpus is just another fancy form of War Armor, though it is referenced specifically in a few of Nikador's other attacks. Speaking of which, Turn 3 is a stronger version of the Furiae Praetor's shared damage nuke, which also has a high chance to imprison and deal bonus damage if Nikador still has any Titanic Corpus stacks remaining. This is then followed by a little stabby stab. Phase 2 starts off by remixing Phase 1's attacks, with turn 1 being the bounce, followed by the glory application and the pillar spawn, with an extra 10% vulnerability towards characters who have their pillars still up being applied. Turn 2 is Phase 1's turn 3, with the big AoE and the small stab. Make sure you have the pillars dead by this turn, since the imprison will all but guarantee your team gets sent straight to next turn. And well, turn 3 here starts off like Phase 1's first turn with this big single target into small AoE, but then Nikador unleashes a massive sword that deals true damage, like actually true damage, based on your max HP and scaling with the amount of pillars left. Remember that the pillars set your max HP to 50%, slowly increasing the more HP they lose, so if those characters get hit while Nikador has 2 or more pillars remaining, then welp, it's an insta-wipe for them. Honestly, the real trouble of this stage is the increased HP coupled with the mandatory sustain thanks to literally just Pogs' DOT, but worse since it can actually kill you as a debuff. A lot of the teams were able to beat Nikador before without a sustain thanks to its relatively low focus damage, the plethora of energy they had to work with, and the fact that killing all 4 pillars was enough to end each phase outright. Nevertheless, since the last 2 parts of that statement are still true, it's the most straightforward check of this 3-night gauntlet. And of course, for those of you playing Casterus, well, the fact that you're pretty much screwed out of using her anywhere else gives you the perfect opportunity to let her steamroll this side as Dawei intended. Moving on to the King stage, the Wave 1 features the 80% Quantum Res Elite again. Wow, they really hate Quantum outside of Night 3, huh? As well as the Cyclonic Swarm Mother and the Magical Girl Troupe. The Swarm Mother, which was last featured 4 rotations ago in the Night 1 Elite Gauntlet, back when Sunday was king, returns with actually only like a 10% increase in HP, which is pretty surprising considering how the Daybreak Mech Elite is 22% tankier than its Night variant in this exact same rotation. No power creep, I guess? It also has ways to drain its own max HP based on hit spam mechanics, making it the most easy to manage out of the 3 enemies if you can manage to burst it down. I'd actually say that the Magical Girl Troupe that spawns with it is a lot more annoying if not running Elation, as it deals an unavoidable bounce shock attack upon death, which when stacked with this stage's debuffs, as we'll get to in a second, can end up being pretty fatal. Skaracabaz as a boss is really quite something, as it's our first boss since Aquila all the way back in 3.7 during Anomaly Arbitration 2nd rotation, to get an HP increase between phases. With 14.5 million HP in phase 1 and over 20 million in phase 2, this dude is tanky, no 2 ways about it. Its 280 toughness also makes it a pretty decent challenge to break outside of break teams, and its 40% quantum res, on top of the Azurewing existing, really signposts do not bring quantum here loud and clear. Interestingly, the stings that spawns are actually a bit weaker than its current Apoc Shadow variant running amok, with the purple Gnaw stings having about 40% less HP, and the orange lesser stings having a much more modest 6% less. Mechanically, this stage also differs in quite a few ways from Apocalyptic Shadow, with the stacking vulnerability per sting death being nerfed from 10% per stack to 5%, which also means the 10 stack cap now hard caps a sting self-inflicted vulnerability to 50%. The Gnaw stings also no longer provide a small heal on death, I guess, and when I say small, I'm talking like 30-ish HP or only enough to trigger a caster's global passive revive realistically. The lesser stings also don't refund a skill point, and neither sting deals toughness damage to the main boss after death, since, well, this really isn't a boss you need to focus on breaking to kill anymore. To compensate though, Skaracabaz only spends the next turn after engaging its multiply state spawning stings upon each hit, compared to Apocalyptic Shadow, where these stings constantly spawning after every hit is active for the entire fight. The real big difference though comes in the form of the stage specific debuffs and buffs. On the debuff side, the new Hemivore in Night 3 and Flow Break in Night 1 make their return here, making Sustainless comps absolute hell to run against this HP wall. Non-follow-up and non-elation teams also have to fight against quite a hefty amount of damage reduction, but as is discussed in Night 1, plenty of teams have generic access to this via Danhung PT, Mortanax Blade, and Tribi, all of whom would have been good into this boss even without Flow Break to begin with. As for buffs, the first buff helps Elation out quite a bit, offering essentially a discount version of Yao Guang's E1 with both a damage boost and flat punchline boost to each AHA instant. Pretty universally good for all 3 Elation DPSs. Though honestly, if you're running Sparksy, the second buff might be a bit stronger as it changes Skaracabaz and their summons 20% lightning and fire resistances into minus 40% lightning and fire super weaknesses. Yup, you heard that right, negative 40 resistance on base. Actually, make that negative 60 fire resistance for the already fire weak lesser stings while we're at it. Funny enough, although this buff was almost certainly intended for Mortanax Blade with this duo of either Ashvale, Akron, or both, with enough investment, it's actually possible to hit the 100 res pen cap with E1 Baldi and E6 Acheron, or just easier Acheron and any support with 20 or more res pen, like Ron May, E1 Robin, or regular Silverwolf. Still their best buff by far because damn, what the actual heck is 60% res pen? And finally, the last buff serves as a much weaker generic damage buff if you can't fulfill either of the first two archetype or element specific conditions. Sure, the fact that the stacking damage buff isn't capped is nice, but only 30% damage and 3% extra damage per kill is pretty underwhelming in comparison to, well, either half a Yaoguang E1 for Elation or double a Welt E4 for Fire or Lightning. Overall, this stage is pretty strong for any of the archetypes that have buffs suited to them or can effectively counteract the stage debuffs, as well as a few characters with some sort of enemy turn manipulation, mainly Welt on support duty and Phynon on DPS duty. This mainly has to do with ensuring Skaracabaz doesn't spawn too many damage absorbing stings on its turns, which we'll get a bit more into later. Once again, peep the Night 2 timestamp for the Azurewing breakdown. Just add 5% more damage since it's coming off a level 100 enemy versus a level 95 one. As for the Cyclonic Swarm Mother, a revisit of its mechanics is probably in order, since it's been a while since we've last seen it. To start, it's part of the Revel and Destruction mob family, which means that it advances and takes its turn every 4 hits, excluding follow-ups and elation skills which do not add to this tally. Note that follow-ups that also count as other types of attacks, like Mortanax's follow-up attack also being treated as a skill, and Fei Xiao's ult also being treated as a follow-up, will add to this tally. Turn 1 of the Mother is a pretty simple single target and blast attack sequence, with turn 2 being the same single target attack, followed by entering the Breeding Frenzy state, which comes with 30% damage reduction, and adding Incubation or that red orb thingy to the action order. This state takes up 1.5 of its usual turns, with the Mother's next action being queued right afterwards. During this time, any advances will cause the Mother to spawn 2 Mirage Fizzle Kids, then delay the incubation state by 10%. These Mirage Fizzle Kids, while advanced to act almost immediately, will spawn with half their max health and come with 30% defense down, making it ideal to spawn them here rather than later. Because if you wait for 30% damage reduction to end and incubation to start, any Mirage Fizzle Kids not spawned below the spawn limit of 4 will come with full HP, no reduced defenses, and a one-time damage barrier, like those Traffic Cone's Aeons of Preservation. During this stage, until all the Fizzle Kids explode, the Mother will unleash AoE attacks every time it takes its turn. Once all the kids are gone though, just repeat the whole sequence from turn 1. As for the Mirage Fizzle Kids themselves, the first one to act will lock onto a target. Any subsequent actions while any kid is locked on will be single target attacks that double in power if a lock-on is active. This lock-on can be removed by either breaking or killing the locked on kid, which upon death will deal about 100,000 quantum damage to its allies. I mentioned quantum damage because, well, that 80% quantum res elite, as you'd expect, will take pretty much nothing from this. Kinda funny how enemy friendly fighter damage also has to go through enemy res. And finally, going on to one of my most personally despised mobs in Wave 1, the Magical Girl Troupe does nothing special with its regular attacks, just single target hits with no additional effects, but its effect on death is where it stands out. If you kill it without dealing elation damage to it first, it will activate its Rainy Day effect, which inflicts a 5 bounce attack with a high chance of shock on each bounce, an unblockable 12 to 1600 AoE to the whole team if you have no cleanse is about as fun as you think it sounds, especially on a stage that already saps 500 HP per turn. More than anything else, this is actually the enemy that makes the stainless runs near impossible. Of course, if running Elation, this effect gets replaced with the Sunny Day effect, a pleasant 25% crit damage buff for the whole team for 2 turns that notably does not deal any damage. I really do not enjoy how uninteractive and anti-sustainless this enemy is, and were it not for Pom-Pom, I really do think this would be my least favorite enemy in the entire Anomaly Arbitration lineup. Just really not a fan of its mechanics like at all. Now getting into the actual boss itself, Skaracabaz's first turn has it initiate a near guaranteed entanglement on a character. Silverwolf global passive anyone? Which also delays their next action by 50%, which Wolfie does not stop, and adds a stackable start of turn entanglement damage debuff. This attack also spawns an extra Gnaw Sting that gets to attack right after. And this attack is immediately followed up by Skaracabaz entering the multiply state. First of all, it gains 30% damage reduction, which is actually a bit worse when considering that it's not the only damage reduction buff it receives, with flow breaks up to 20% damage reduction, multiplying in order to cut your final damage down by as much as 44%. For phase 1, each hit it receives, including any sting death damage, spawns a new sting. Notably, each new sting spawned while any sort of debuff field is up, like Mortanax Blades, counts as an action where a debuff is applied, aka adding an extra Acheron stack. And well, with the reduced sting HP, as well as more importantly a top tier Amper in Mortanax Blade, this interaction when paired with the AoE debuff, each sting also applies on death, allows for Acheron to borderline ult loop versus this stage. For most other characters though, the constant spawning of stings serves to either dilute their single target or set up their AoE, especially if you have E1 Tribi. The multiply state is removed from either Skaracabaz's next turn or breaking it, upon which it deals a big chunk of AoE toughness damage to all enemies including itself. This actually kinda screws over Firefly's E2, funny enough, as it not only prevents her from continuously resetting off of the no longer spawning stings, but the AoE nuke also steals any break and exo break bars she can exploit for further damage, since 240 toughness damage to everyone is a lot. And well, if you're running Rappa for some reason, losing both constant spawns and toughness bars hurts even more. Skaracabaz's next turn is then a powerful blast attack followed by a slightly weaker single target. The Gnaw Stings themselves perform pretty simple single target attacks, prioritizing any enemy's attack by Skaracabaz's first entanglement attack, regardless of whether they were actually CC'd or not, and adding an extra entanglement damage stack if able to. I think this priority targeting state disappears after said character takes their first turn, but someone correct me if I'm wrong. Their death damage is about 50,000 AoE quantum death damage, which as mentioned before is reduced by enemy resistances, but more importantly, inflicts a permanent 5% vulnerability to all hit enemies. Anyways, moving on to phase 2, turn 1 is the same as phase 1's turn 1, with the exception of spawning 2 stings instead of 1 per hit, and having a 50-50 chance to spawn either Gnaw Stings or lesser stings. Turn 2 then replaces the powerful blast in phase 1 with the powerful AoE attack, followed by the same single target hit afterwards. Rinse and repeat. The lesser stings, as some might know, take their first turn here immediately at 0 action value and explode on their next turn, inflicting damage and a high chance to outrage one ally and all adjacent targets for 1 turn. They deal the same death damage as the Gnaw Stings, just as wind damage, which changes damage calculations because of type resistance a little, but more importantly also adds 10% vul to all hit enemies. Overall, I'd say this King stage is much harder to fully clear compared to the past iterations, simply due to the sheer HP increase each time around, as well as a decrease in beneficial mechanics compared to its Epoch Shadow counterpart. In fact, it's the closest King in terms of HP pull and sustain check since Aquila, with the added annoyance of CCs this time around. I guess Hoyo finally listened and started making King stages hard again after the Great Septimus nerf, making sustainless runs and thus 0 cycles much easier. Though, unfortunately, the night stages were not made easier to compensate. As for general thoughts, I'll keep it brief by saying that Hoyo really seems to hate sustainless teams, and as such, the ability for Mono Rem to find at least one night stage to thrive in still succeeds. Stemming from this, whether you like it or not though, expect to see a consistent uptick in the appearances of both Mortanax Blade and E4 Welt in like every single low cost run ever. It seems like we're finally entering the age where Nihility is more generically powerful than Harmony somehow, and thanks to the archetype mostly discarding effect hit rate, with those still depending on it having most of their EHR needs satisfied via tutorial, it's even now the go-to archetype for sustainless survival. A major glow up from when they used to be the squishiest kids on the block. Congratulations Acheron mains, now that double Nihility is finally in, even at E0 she's finally capable of performing meta-worthy feats, with her kit being fully utilized and her Nihility restriction no longer being a burden. Just don't be upset when she ends up stealing the best journalists for the upcoming Starworm mode. Or worse, ends up having them stolen from her by whatever DPS needs to help the most. Thanks for watching.